In the closing months of 1939, while Europe burned and America still debated its role in the conflict, a handful of officers at the United States Army Air Corps began speaking quietly about a new kind of bomber. The interwar doctrine of strategic bombardment, born from the teachings of Billy Mitchell and the Air Corps Tactical School, had long promised that properly armed aircraft could cripple an enemy's industry and end a war without another trench being dug. Yet the machines available to the Air Corps in 1939, the B-17 Flying Fortress and the newer B-24 Liberator, were already nearing the limits of their range and altitude. The planners wanted something that could cross oceans, strike any continent, and return home without refueling. Such ambitions sounded grandiose even in Washington. The Great Depression had left deep scars in federal budgeting, and Congress regarded every new bomber proposal as another expensive experiment. But global events were already shifting those boundaries. The fall of France in 1940 and the Battle of Britain convinced many in the War Department that geography alone would not protect the United States forever. Long-range aircraft might soon be required not merely for deterrence, but for survival. In August 1940, the Air Corps Materiel Division issued specification XC-218, calling for a super bomber capable of carrying a 20,000-pound load at 400 miles per hour over distances exceeding 5,000 miles. The technical demands were staggering. The aircraft would need pressurized compartments to keep its crew alive above 30,000 feet, self-sealing fuel tanks for protection, and a flight control system capable of managing engines more powerful than anything yet produced. Only Boeing, with its experimental pressurized Model 307 Stratoliner, possessed limited experience in such construction. By early 1941, Boeing's engineers in Seattle began sketching the outline of what they called Model 345. The design called for 4 new Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines, each producing more than 2,000 horsepower, and a wingspan of 141 feet. The estimated unit cost exceeded anything the U.S. government had ever paid for an airplane. Inside Boeing's boardroom, some executives quietly feared that the company's reputation, perhaps its existence, might depend on an aircraft that could not yet be built. Across the Atlantic, German intelligence officers were already collecting fragments of this information. The American press, though restricted by wartime secrecy, still carried articles about giant bombers under development. In late 1941, a Luftwaffe attaché in Washington reported that the United States was wasting resources on a machine too large for practical war. Within the Reich Air Ministry, those words became accepted wisdom. The Germans, then at the height of their power, considered long-range heavy bombers a strategic dead end. Their own Heinkel He-177 Greif, supposed to be Germany's answer to the B-17, had proved a disaster, its coupled engines prone to catastrophic fires. The experience reinforced a belief that physics itself limited what piston aircraft could achieve. The Americans disagreed. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor in December 1941, President Roosevelt authorized full production of the superbomber sight unseen. The order, unprecedented in scale, committed the United States to spend more on a single aircraft type than it had on the entire Army Air Corps a decade earlier. Factories would be built before prototypes had even flown. Boeing Plant 2 in Seattle expanded overnight. New assembly complexes rose in Wichita, Omaha, and Marietta. Thousands of engineers relocated with little more than blueprints in their hands. Inside the Air Forces, enthusiasm bordered on religious conviction. General Henry Hap Arnold, recently promoted to command the newly formed U.S. Army Air Forces, believed that industrial willpower could solve any technical problem given enough men and money. "If it takes $1 billion," he told aides, "it will still be cheaper than losing a war." That sentence, repeated in newspapers and speeches, soon multiplied into myth. By 1944, the real cost would exceed $3 billion. During the first months of 1942, engineers wrestled with the physics of altitude and pressurization. Traditional bombers were open to the air, their crews enduring sub-zero cold through oxygen masks. The new aircraft demanded sealed compartments connected by a narrow pressurized tunnel running above the bomb bay, an innovation that required not only stronger materials but entirely new manufacturing techniques. Boeing recruited metallurgists from across the nation. The Glenn L. Martin Company in Maryland built a dedicated plant just to produce the fuselage sections. In all, the project absorbed more than 200 subcontractors. To outsiders, it seemed reckless. To the Germans, it looked comical. When American propaganda films showed conceptual drawings of the massive bomber cruising serenely above the clouds, German newspapers ridiculed them as Hollywood fantasies. Technical bulletins within the Luftwaffe's research office carried sarcastic summaries. 4 engines, each of unproven reliability, pressurization systems suitable for a Zeppelin, defensive guns fired by electricity. Impractical. The underlying assumption was that America's technological optimism would collapse under its own complexity. Yet optimism had its own logic. The American design philosophy emphasized redundancy. If one system failed, another would take its place. Each engine nacelle housed dual-turbo superchargers. Each gun turret could be operated manually if power failed. The aircraft's size, once criticized, became an advantage. It could carry enough fuel to cross oceans and still climb beyond 30,000 feet, out of reach of most fighters. Engineers knew the risks, but pressed on. The Wright R-3350 engine remained the single most difficult component. Its 18 cylinders produced enormous heat, and early models seized during ground tests. Wright's plant in Ohio operated 24 hours a day trying to perfect cooling fins and cowl flaps. While these technical dramas unfolded, the German High Command remained confident that the American industrial system, untested under total war, would drown in its own paperwork. The Reich's propaganda portrayed the United States as a land of abundance but little discipline. "They build refrigerators, not weapons," remarked one radio commentator in late 1942. German aircraft production, though shrinking under Allied bombing, still prided itself on craftsmanship and efficiency. Few inside the Reich imagined that the Americans could produce a bomber heavier than a locomotive every single day. By November 1942, the first prototype, serial 41-002, rolled out of Boeing's Seattle plant. At 99,000 pounds loaded weight, it dwarfed anything in the sky. Test pilot Eddie Allen described it as a ship that flies. Taxi trials revealed immediate problems. Engines overheated, propellers vibrated, and the nose-wheel strut collapsed on landing. Allen remained optimistic. "We'll fix it," he told reporters. "Everything new begins with smoke." The smoke soon turned to flame. On February 18, 1943, during a test flight, the prototype caught fire and crashed into a meat-packing plant south of Seattle, killing Allen, his crew, and 20 civilians on the ground. The accident stunned the nation. Newspapers questioned whether the superbomber was cursed. The Germans seized upon the story gleefully. Luftwaffe bulletins reprinted translated headlines with commentary. "The American dream literally falls from the sky." Inside Boeing, morale nearly collapsed. The company had lost its chief test pilot and its faith in the program. But General Arnold refused to cancel the contract. "We'll build it until it works," he declared, "and then we'll build 10,000. His decision transformed the program from an experiment into an industrial crusade. The crash investigation identified faulty engine mounts and inadequate ventilation, issues that could be solved with time and money, both of which the United States possessed in quantities unknown to its enemies. By mid-1943, redesigned aircraft were rolling out under tighter inspection. Each plane cost more than $500,000, not including research and plant construction. Adjusted for inflation, the total expenditure approached $3 billion. By far the most expensive weapons project of the war. Yet in the calculus of total war, cost mattered less than capability. The air forces now needed a weapon capable of reaching the Japanese mainland, a target still beyond the range of every other bomber. For the Germans, these developments were distant curiosities. Their intelligence reports from Japan hinted at American activity in China and India, but the Luftwaffe had its own existential crisis. The Allies' bombing campaign over Europe consumed every fighter squadron available. The Reich Air Ministry filed the American Superfortress under Pacific Concern, non-priority. Few realized that the technology perfected in those faraway factories would soon redefine the limits of air power everywhere. By the summer of 1943, the factories in Wichita, Omaha, and Marietta were operating at a scale that even seasoned industrial planners had never imagined possible. The B-29 project had become not merely an aircraft program, but a national experiment in mobilization. At the peak of production, more than 60,000 workers streamed through Boeing's gates each morning. Rows of women in coveralls riveted aluminum panels. Technicians checked the alignment of gun turrets with micrometer precision. Inspectors moved along assembly lines with clipboards that read, "Confidential, Superfortress." Every component arrived through an elaborate choreography of suppliers spread across 27 states. Engines came from Wright's plant in Ohio, propellers from Hamilton Standard in Connecticut, and the plexiglass nose sections from California. Trains carried parts across the continent under armed guard. To maintain secrecy, the Air Forces referred to each factory by code numbers rather than names. The total cost of this infrastructure, new rail spurs, power grids, housing for workers, would eventually push the program's bill near the $3 billion mark. At Boeing's Renton plant, managers joked that the assembly floor was longer than a mile and noisier than war itself. Yet the war was never far away. The workers knew that their product was meant for distant skies over the Pacific, where Japanese forces still controlled a vast empire. Every bomber completed in Kansas or Washington had to travel thousands of miles by ferry routes that spanned Hawaii, the Central Pacific, and India before it could strike its targets. Technical problems persisted. The Wright R-3350 engines, now fitted with new cooling baffles, still overheated during climb. Turbine failures caused fires that sent test crews scrambling for parachutes. General Arnold grew impatient but refused to relent. "We are paying for the future," he told his staff. "If it takes time, it takes time." He knew that no other aircraft offered the combination of altitude, range, and bomb load that planners believed would be necessary to reach the Japanese homeland. While engineers struggled with metallurgy, the Luftwaffe's attention remained fixed on the collapsing front in Europe. Allied bombers had begun pounding Hamburg, Cologne, and Essen with devastating results. German analysts received scattered reports from their Tokyo allies about a large American bomber seen in China, but the accounts were contradictory. Some claimed it was merely an enlarged B-17. Others insisted it could fly at altitudes unreachable by Japanese interceptors. Within the Reich Air Ministry, such reports were dismissed as exaggeration. An aircraft of that weight cannot sustain lift beyond 9 kilometers, one memo stated flatly. These rumors reflect enemy propaganda rather than performance. In July 1943, the second prototype of the B-29 achieved a successful cross-country flight from Seattle to Washington, D.C., averaging over 350 miles per hour. American newspapers called it the future of long-range warfare. The article was reprinted in neutral Sweden, where German intelligence clipped and translated it. The technical staff annotated the margin with a note of disbelief. Range estimate inflated by 50%. The German analysts, accustomed to measuring capability by their own limitations, simply could not imagine the industrial abundance that made the American claims plausible. By autumn, the first training groups were formed under the newly created XX Bomber Command, commanded by Major General Kenneth B. Wolfe. They trained in the American South, flying mock raids over the Gulf of Mexico. Many air crews had never seen an airplane so large. The pressurized cabins demanded new operating procedures. Oxygen masks were replaced by environmental controls. Engineers monitored temperature gauges and pressure dials instead of frost on their goggles. Pilots remarked that the cockpit felt more like a passenger liner than a bomber. The new gunnery system, 5 remote-controlled turrets guided by analog computers, required intensive training in mathematics as well as marksmanship. While crews learned, the air forces wrestled with logistics. The strategic plan, codenamed Operation Matterhorn, envisioned B-29s striking Japan from bases in India and staging through forward fields in China. The concept was daring but fragile. Every gallon of fuel burned over Japan had to be flown from India across the Himalayas, a route known as the Hump. Transport aircraft carried barrels of gasoline in their fuselages, losing almost as much fuel as they delivered. It was an unsustainable system, but at the time it was the only way to bring the new bomber within range of Tokyo. In the spring of 1944, the first combat groups deployed to India. The journey itself became a feat of navigation. From the factories of Kansas and Washington, the bombers flew through Florida, Puerto Rico, Brazil, across the Atlantic to Africa, then on to Karachi and Calcutta, a 12,000-mile odyssey before their first mission. Many aircraft suffered mechanical failures en route. Several were lost in accidents. Maintenance crews labored under tropical heat to keep engines running. Every breakdown added urgency to the engineers back home, who issued new technical orders almost weekly. In Berlin, Luftwaffe intelligence began to take a closer look. Reports from Japanese liaison officers described American bombers operating at altitudes above 10 kilometers, beyond the effective range of most anti-aircraft guns. German experts debated whether such heights were even sustainable for piston engines. "Either their instruments are wrong," one colonel wrote, "or they have invented an engine cooling method unknown to us." The statement, intended as sarcasm, was closer to the truth than he realized. The R-3350's complex turbo-supercharger system did indeed operate differently from anything the Germans had fielded. But even if they had known the details, they lacked the industrial capacity to copy it. The first combat mission took place on June 5, 1944, when 98 B-29s lifted off from bases in India to strike railway facilities at Bangkok, Thailand. The results were disappointing. Only half the bombs hit the target, but the fact that such a mission was possible at all startled observers. 2 weeks later, B-29s attacked the Japanese mainland for the first time from airfields around Chengdu, China. Flying 1,500 miles each way, they reached Yorita on the southern tip of Honshu, dropping high explosives on the steelworks that supplied Japan's war machine. The raid caused limited physical damage but immense psychological shock. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, bombs had fallen on the Japanese home islands. German newspapers carried the Japanese communiques with a tone of mockery. "Enemy propaganda claims to have bombed Tokyo," wrote the Völkischer Beobachter. "Our Japanese allies report negligible results." Once again, American fantasy exceeds fact. Within the Reich Air Ministry, the laughter returned. The B-29, they insisted, was a wasteful diversion that could never achieve strategic effect. They could not see that their own philosophy of warfare, short-range precision, fast turnaround, was already obsolete. Back in India, the pilots of the 20th Air Force struggled with monsoon weather, mechanical unreliability, and the nightmare of supply. Yet with each mission, the aircraft improved. Ground crews learned to replace an engine in hours rather than days. Air crews mastered high-altitude navigation by radar. By autumn 1944, the B-29's range and reliability had increased dramatically, and the U.S. Navy's advance across the Pacific offered new bases much closer to Japan. The conquest of the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam changed everything. From those runways, The Superfortress could reach every major Japanese city with full bomb loads. As American engineers prepared those bases, German intelligence officers continued to underestimate the significance. Their focus remained on Europe, where Allied bombers already dominated the skies. The idea that a single aircraft type could now fly from the Central Pacific to Japan and back seemed irrelevant to a Reich fighting for survival in its own airspace. One Luftwaffe staff analysis filed in December 1944 concluded, "The American heavy bomber program represents economic extravagance rather than strategic necessity. We note with amusement that even the Japanese complain of its mechanical difficulties." That final note of amusement was one of the last instances of German levity about the subject. Within months, those same bombers would reduce Japan's industrial capacity to rubble, and the laughter would die completely. In January 1945, the airfields of the Mariana Islands became the busiest places on Earth. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were now transformed into a single, sprawling complex of concrete and steel. Each island held multiple runways, fuel depots, workshops, and barracks. From the air, the installations resembled small cities, purpose-built for one mission: to bring the Japanese Empire to its knees from the sky. Night and day, the new aircraft streamed in from the continental United States. Crews stepped down from their silver bombers blinking in the equatorial sun, greeted by ground crews who had already begun assembling the infrastructure of the strategic offensive. The B-29 was no longer an experiment. It was now the heart of a global logistics network stretching across half the world. The Americans had achieved something that defied every European assumption about what an industrial democracy could accomplish in wartime: mass production of a machine so sophisticated that even a single prototype had once been deemed impossible. By early 1945, the program had consumed over $3 billion, a sum greater than the Manhattan Project's budget. Every dollar was visible in the details: the polished gun turrets guided by analog computers, the pressurized cabins lined with insulation, the twin bomb bays capable of carrying 10 tons of ordnance. The aircraft's sophistication astonished visiting British officers who had cut their teeth on the comparatively primitive Lancasters. One RAF liaison summed up the difference bluntly: "The B-29 is a factory that flies." The German air staff, trapped in their own besieged continent, could only read about it in intercepted dispatches and Japanese cables. The Reich was crumbling. Allied troops had crossed the Rhine, and fuel shortages grounded most of the Luftwaffe. Yet within the technical sections of the Air Ministry, analysts still compiled reports out of habit. A February 1945 memorandum, titled U.S. Heavy Bomber Developments, acknowledged the aircraft's achievements for the first time without sarcasm. Reports from Japan indicate an aircraft of remarkable altitude performance and range. It read, "It appears the Americans have solved multiple technical difficulties that we regarded as insurmountable." The writer added, with reluctant admiration, "The industrial commitment required is beyond European capacity." Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the offensive entered a new phase. The American High Command, under General Curtis LeMay, shifted tactics from high-altitude precision bombing to low-level incendiary attacks. Experience had shown that Japan's light wooden cities were vulnerable to fire. On the night of March 9, 1945, 279 B-29s flew over Tokyo at altitudes between 5,000 and 7,000 feet, dropping nearly 2,000 tons of incendiaries. The city burned for hours. Entire neighborhoods vanished in a single night, and the death toll exceeded 80,000. In Berlin, German officers following the war through Japanese communiques recognized the terrible efficiency of the new American doctrine. They had seen their own cities, Hamburg, Dresden, reduced to ruins by similar raids. The irony was bitter. The enemy they had mocked for extravagance was now wielding the most advanced bomber in the world to annihilate another Axis capital. Technically, the B-29 represented a quantum leap over anything Germany had managed to produce. Its Wright R-3350 engines, though temperamental, delivered unprecedented power and reliability after thousands of modifications. Each aircraft carried nearly 7,000 gallons of fuel, allowing operations at ranges exceeding 3,500 miles. Its 4 pressurized compartments were connected by a narrow tunnel that allowed crew members to move about even at 30,000 feet. The central fire control system, operated by analog computation, allowed a single gunner to direct multiple turrets with accuracy that astonished even radar technicians. German engineers studied post-war photographs with incredulity. The concept of a remotely controlled defensive network had been discussed in the Reich in the late 1930s, but dismissed as impractical. Too complex for combat conditions, one 1939 design review had concluded. Yet the Americans had not only implemented it, but refined it to perfection. While German factories lay in ruins, American production lines were still expanding. Between late 1944 and August 1945, Boeing and its partner plants rolled out an average of 4 B-29s per day. The scale of industrial mobilization stunned even Allied observers. When compared to the entire wartime output of the German aviation industry, the B-29 program alone represented a greater expenditure of labor and materials than the combined production of all German bombers from 1943 onward. By April, the raids intensified. Osaka, Nagoya, and Kobe burned in succession. In Tokyo, survivors dug firebreaks through the ashes of their city, while American planners prepared the final phase of the campaign. By this point, the Japanese air defense system was collapsing. Fuel shortages and pilot attrition had left them nearly defenseless. 4 German officers receiving reports through the dwindling channels of Axis communication, it was a grim echo of their own situation. Inside what remained of the Reich Air Ministry, a final report dated April 15, 1945 attempted to summarize the American aircraft's significance. The Boeing B-29 represents the ultimate expression of industrial warfare. It is the synthesis of mechanical reliability, high-altitude capability, and long-range endurance achieved through material abundance rather than theoretical innovation. Its cost, reportedly exceeding $3 billion, is evidence of a system in which resources replace genius. The results, however, cannot be denied. That line, "Resources replace genius," was underlined in red pencil by a post-war Allied translator. To the Germans, it was meant as a criticism. To later historians, it became the defining statement of the era. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. Its officers never witnessed the final act of the bomber they had mocked. 3 months later, 2 modified B-29s carried atomic bombs to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bringing the war to an abrupt and terrible end. Those flights, Enola Gay and Boxcar, represented the culmination of every dollar and every rivet poured into the Superfortress. The $3 billion gamble had rewritten military history. In the ruins of post-war Europe, Allied investigators invited captured German engineers to examine the aircraft firsthand. At airfields in England and America, they walked around the silver giants, measuring, taking notes, and asking quiet questions. Some shook their heads in disbelief. One Luftwaffe scientist, upon entering the pressurized cockpit, murmured, "We would have needed a decade to build this." The Americans were polite but firm. They wanted technical insights, not apologies. The German experts, many of them now recruited under Operation Paperclip, studied the remote turrets, the engine cowlings, and the pressurization systems. Again and again, they remarked on one difference: the redundancy of design. Every system had a backup. Where a German engineer might have saved weight, the Americans added reliability. That philosophy, more than any individual invention, explained why the Superfortress succeeded where the Heinkel Greif had failed. In the technical libraries of occupied Germany, Allied officers catalogued captured documents and compared them with American blueprints. The contrast was stark. German files were filled with brilliant prototypes, jet bombers, rocket planes, advanced interceptors, but almost none had reached operational maturity. The American files contained a single design refined through relentless production. The difference reflected not talent but doctrine. During interviews conducted in 1946, former German generals were asked what they had thought of the B-29 when first hearing of it in 1942. Most laughed ruefully. "We thought it was propaganda," one replied. "A machine that big could not be built in numbers. We assumed it would remain a prototype. We were wrong." Historians compiling those interviews decades later found in them a parable about industrial modernity. The B-29 was not only a triumph of engineering, it was the ultimate proof that wars in the 20th century would be won by economies, not by individuals. The Germans had trusted in genius. The Americans had trusted in scale. By the late 1940s, as the Cold War began, the lessons of the Superfortress became doctrine for every major power. The Soviet Union reverse-engineered captured B-29s to create its own Tu-4 bomber. British designers adopted pressurization and centralized fire control for the next generation of long-range aircraft. The era of small-run innovation had ended. Mass production and systems engineering had taken its place. In classrooms and lecture halls, the story was retold endlessly. How the most expensive weapons project of World War II, derided as an impossible folly, had reshaped the world. Each retelling began the same way, with the laughter of German officers in 1942, and ended with the silence of 1945. Between those years lay the proof that imagination, when backed by inexhaustible industry, could make even absurd dreams fly. In the first calm months after the surrender of Japan, engineers, soldiers, and historians alike tried to make sense of what the war had revealed. The ruins of Europe and Asia were proof that industrial power had become the decisive weapon. Every major combatant had produced brilliant machines, but only the United States had produced them in such numbers that mechanical failure, loss, and distance ceased to matter. At the center of that revelation stood the B-29 Superfortress. Within weeks of VJ Day, representatives from the Allied air ministries were invited to Guam to see the bombers that had brought the Pacific War to an end. Rows of silver giants gleamed under the equatorial sun, each still streaked with soot from the final raids. British observers, accustomed to the hand-built precision of their Lancasters, walked around the American aircraft shaking their heads. "Every one identical," one of them wrote in his notebook. "Not a masterpiece, but a miracle of repetition." Soviet officers, officially allies but already viewed with suspicion, measured the wingspans and took careful photographs that would later guide the construction of the Tu-4. In Germany, the Allied occupation authorities began cataloguing what was left of the Reich's aircraft industry. They found half-finished Me-264 America bomber fuselages in hangars, abandoned jet prototypes on remote airfields, and shelves full of blueprints for projects that had never left paper. When compared with the documents arriving from Boeing's Seattle headquarters, the contrast was absolute. The American program had relied on thousands of incremental adjustments and feedback loops. The German one had relied on promises. A report compiled by the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee in 1946 summarized the difference in a single paragraph. German development was characterized by brilliance and fragmentation, American development by scale and persistence. The B-29 program demonstrates that sustained refinement under abundant resources will outpace isolated innovation, however imaginative. That conclusion entered the textbooks of every Air Staff College in the post-war world. The B-29 became the case study for what the Americans began to call systems engineering, the coordination of design, testing, and production as one continuous process. Boeing's engineers, once ordinary factory managers, now lectured at universities about production logistics. Charts from the Wichita plant showing part flows and inspection cycles were reprinted in management journals. The same methods later guided the design of jet airliners and intercontinental missiles. For the former Luftwaffe technicians interned in Britain and the United States, the experience was humbling. Many were employed under the Allied scientific intelligence programs that would later merge into Project Paperclip. In workshops at Wright Field and Farnborough, they examined captured B-29 components side by side with their own wartime designs. They admired the welding of the pressurized fuselage sections, the balance of the control surfaces, the compactness of the remote control gun turrets. "It is not a beautiful machine," one of them admitted to an American officer, "but it works, and it keeps working." That practicality impressed them more than elegance ever had. Historians in the 1950s described the B-29 as the moment when aviation became a science of organization. It had shown that a complex machine could only exist within a still more complex human system. In order to keep the bombers flying, the U.S. Army Air Forces had built entire economies around them. Training schools, spare parts depots, weather stations, and transport routes that spanned the planet. The aircraft itself was merely the visible summit of an invisible pyramid of effort. Meanwhile, the Cold War was already transforming yesterday's weapon into tomorrow's deterrent. The same airframes that had firebombed Tokyo were refitted to carry the first generation of nuclear bombs. Crews who had once flown from Tinian now trained for polar routes that would lead them toward the Soviet Union if another war began. The pressurized cabin and long endurance that had seemed extravagant in 1942 were suddenly essential. In 1948, when the Berlin airlift began, a few of the veteran superfortresses even ferried supplies to the same city whose engineers had once scoffed at their design. Children in the ruins looked up at the four-engine silhouettes and mistook them for the bombers of old. Few knew that they were now bringing food, not fire. In post-war Germany, the study of the B-29 became part of a wider process of national introspection. Technical universities reopened with Allied approval, and new engineering curricula emphasized the value of testing, documentation, and cross-disciplinary collaboration. Precisely the traits that had allowed the Americans to overcome the difficulties of the R-3350 engine. Professors who had served in the war used the Superfortress as a cautionary example. When you assume that something cannot be done, one lecturer at Aachen told his students in 1952, you have already decided who will defeat you. The United States, flush with victory, dismantled most of its wartime factories but preserved the lessons they had produced. Boeing retained the expertise gained from pressurization and large-scale assembly, using it to design the B-47 Stratojet and later the B-52. Both owed their lineage to the flying factory of 1942. Each new generation of aircraft designers studied the blueprints of the B-29 the way architects study the Parthenon, not to copy it, but to understand the logic that made it possible. By the early 1960s, when jet bombers and missiles had rendered propeller aircraft obsolete, the surviving superfortresses were relegated to weather reconnaissance and target towing. Yet the machine's aura only grew. Museums restored them, veterans gathered beneath their wings for photographs, and aviation historians continued to write about the day German intelligence had laughed at the idea. In the new Federal Republic of Germany, those stories circulated in technical magazines as parables of humility. The laughter of 1942 had become an emblem of short-sightedness. In 1970, when the Smithsonian Institution began restoring Enola Gay, the debate over the aircraft's moral legacy briefly overshadowed its technical one. But even the critics acknowledged its revolutionary nature. The $3 billion investment that had once seemed reckless now stood as proof of what a democracy, when threatened, could mobilize. The aircraft systems had pioneered everything from remote fire control to high-altitude pressurization, technologies that later underpinned commercial aviation. Passengers flying in jetliners across the Atlantic owed part of their comfort to experiments first conducted in the Superfortress. For the few surviving German officers interviewed in that era, the memory of the program still carried a sting. Asked by a journalist in 1974 why they had dismissed the B-29, one retired colonel answered simply, "Because we believed the world was bounded by our experience." It was a confession shared by many of his contemporaries. The Reich had relied on the assumption that engineering genius could compensate for dwindling resources. America had proved that disciplined abundance could out-engineer genius itself. The later historians who compiled these testimonies saw in them a universal lesson about technology and arrogance. The B-29 had not been a miracle. It had been the natural consequence of process. Its cost, $3 billion, was less a symbol of extravagance than of faith in iteration. Every problem that had caused laughter in Berlin had been solved by persistence in Wichita. The final product was not perfect, but it existed, and that fact alone was enough to change history. By the end of the 20th century, only a handful of airworthy superfortresses remained. When one of them, Fifi, toured Europe in 1992, its arrival in Germany drew crowds to every airfield. The aircraft's polished skin reflected the faces of people who had grown up with stories of its power. Among them were engineers, veterans, and students. Many brought cameras. Some simply stood in silence. The pilot's briefing included a line that echoed through the hangars. "You are about to see the plane they said could never be built." The crowd applauded softly, and as the engines roared to life, for deep rhythmic notes carried across the tarmac, the sound of a lesson that had taken half a century to learn. When the Cold War ended and archives opened across Europe and the United States, historians finally gained access to the documents that explained the inner workings of the B-29 program and the German intelligence assessments that had mocked it. What they found confirmed what veterans had long known, that the laughter in Berlin had been born not of contempt but of disbelief. The idea that a single democratic nation could devote such vast resources to one aircraft, and succeed, defied everything the Reich had experienced about the limits of industrial war. Researchers tracing the story through thousands of pages of correspondence uncovered the texture of that disbelief. In 1942, German analysts in the Reich Air Ministry had calculated the theoretical ceiling of any piston-engine bomber to be roughly 30,000 feet, the maximum height at which engines of the time could still breathe and maintain power. The notion that the Americans would build a pressurized aircraft to fly higher struck them as science fiction. They were right according to their own data. They were wrong according to the future. Boeing's engineers, working with resources that dwarfed the German economy, had rewritten those limits within 2 years. The post-1990 release of American production figures also astonished economists. The B-29 program had consumed 160,000 tons of aluminum, 1.5 million miles of wiring, and the labor of more than 300,000 workers spread across 41 states. Every single bomber represented a network of factories, railways, and supply chains that linked the continent together. For students of industrial history, the Superfortress became the symbol of a society's ability to coordinate complexity at scale. In Germany, the generation of engineers that came of age after reunification studied the aircraft in a spirit of sober respect. Technical universities used it as a model for project management courses, dissecting its production flow, risk mitigation, and iterative design philosophy. At the Deutsches Museum in Munich, a long-term exhibition juxtaposed fragments of the unfinished He-177 with models of the B-29. The caption beneath the German bomber read, "Innovation without infrastructure." Beneath the American one, "Infrastructure as innovation." Visitors needed no further explanation. In the United States, the surviving superfortresses became floating museums of metal and memory. At air shows, they taxied slowly before crowds of veterans and children, their 4 engines thrumming with the sound that had once carried across the Pacific. Pilots who had flown them in war grew old telling the same story, of a machine that had been doubted by friend and foe alike, and of the factories that turned skepticism into aluminum reality. They described how crews had slept inside the fuselage on long flights, how the pressurized cabin had felt like another world, and how each mission seemed to shrink the planet a little more. The deeper historical meaning of the aircraft extended far beyond its combat record. For scholars of technology, it marked the birth of modern aerospace management, the shift from individual invention to collective engineering. The same methods that built the B-29 would later guide the development of computers, nuclear submarines, and space programs. The idea that complexity could be conquered through organization, rather than inspiration, traced its lineage directly to the $3 billion gamble of 1942. In Germany, that realization provoked both admiration and melancholy. The wartime laughter of the Luftwaffe officers had been, in retrospect, the final echo of an older worldview, one that believed in the supremacy of genius over industry. The collapse of that belief was as complete as the collapse of the Reich itself. Post-war German aviation, rebuilt under NATO, adopted American methods almost entirely. The manuals for the new Luftwaffe spoke of system reliability, modular maintenance, and statistical process control, phrases that would have sounded foreign to the engineers of Peenemünde or Dessau. The lesson had been learned too late, but learned thoroughly. By the dawn of the 21st century, the B-29's physical presence had nearly vanished, but its intellectual shadow stretched across every aircraft in the sky. Pressurized cabins, redundant systems, and global logistics networks were now standard practice. Even commercial airliners owed their lineage to the engineering philosophy that the Superfortress had proven under fire. In that sense, the $3 billion investment had never stopped paying dividends. When historians gathered in 2005 to mark the 60th anniversary of the war's end, a panel in Washington, D.C., included both American and German scholars. One of them, a professor from Munich, summed up the story in a single sentence that drew quiet nods around the room. The B-29 was not the triumph of technology over Germany, it was the triumph of process over pride. No one disagreed. A few years later, in 2010, the restored Enola Gay went on permanent display at the Smithsonian's Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center. Visitors filed past the enormous fuselage, its polished skin reflecting the lights of the hangar. Some came to ponder the moral questions of Hiroshima. Others simply marveled at the engineering. On a nearby plaque, curators included a quote from an anonymous German technical officer captured in 1945. "We thought it was a joke." Beneath it, the museum's historians added their own line. "It was not." That understated exchange encapsulated the entire arc of the story, from disbelief to demonstration, from laughter to lesson. The B-29 had begun as an absurd dream sketched on drafting tables in Seattle and dismissed as wasteful by enemies who could not imagine such abundance. 3 years later, it had circled the globe and ended a war. Half a century after that, it had become a symbol of how imagination, when backed by discipline and resources, can redefine the possible. In the end, the $3 billion investment that the Germans laughed at was less about airplanes than about ideas. It proved that engineering could be democratic, that thousands of minds working together could accomplish what no single genius could. It proved that ridicule fades faster than innovation. And it left behind a final paradox, that the machine built to destroy also built the framework for the peaceful aviation that followed. Today, when one of the few surviving superfortresses rises into the air, its polished wings catching the sunlight, it carries no bombs and no enemies. It carries a reminder. The low rumble of its engines is the echo of a time when laughter met persistence, and persistence won.